And I also need to greet, there are 7 groups that are doing this LiFT course offline, so I want to say hello to the group at Hamilton Cathedral, to the other group at New Plymouth, to Raglan, to Te Kuiti, to Kawhia, to Hawera, and to Te Aroha. So hello to all of those of you who are doing this course offline. It's great to have you as part of this group too. Right, this evening everybody, and it's hello from us here in Hamilton, Charlotte Brown House. Excellent. Right, now this evening everybody, we are going to be covering the entire Old Testament. This is no mean feat, I have to say, but we will give it a go. So hopefully during the week you've had a chance to at least familiarise yourself with the Old Testament and with the order and the structure of it, but we'll touch base with that as we go along. Let's just spend the first little while, as we do usually, touching base with one another about the material that we covered last week. Of course, last week we spent a good deal of time thinking about prayer, and I wonder what, if anything, has struck you during the week about this topic. Is there anything that has stood out for you? Any type of prayer perhaps that we discussed that's intrigued you? Maybe you've tried something new this week. So let's spend the first 10 minutes debriefing and reflecting on the material last week and how that's impacted on our journey to this evening. Okay, I shall check in with you in a little while. Okay, everybody, let's begin the Bible and the Old Testament. So it is quite daunting, actually, to attempt to cover the whole of the Bible in 4 sessions, never mind trying to cover the entire Old Testament in 1 session. But part of the purpose of LiFT is to give us an overview and a taster, I suppose, and I think at the very least it's helpful to have a sense of the structure and how the different bits of the Old Testament fit together, and something about some of the themes as well that emerge, which you may be familiar with, or you may be surprised by. We'll see how we go. There are probably parts of the Old Testament that you've personally spent more time with than other parts. I don't spend a whole lot of time reading through Leviticus, for example. I don't know about you. Legislation may be your thing. But the fact is that Leviticus is part of the Bible, and it's as much a part of the Bible as Genesis, say, or the Gospels, things that are easier to read. So I think for me, part of the challenge with the Old Testament particularly has been the bits of it that I find really difficult. But it's at that point then I have to remind myself that, well, this is also part of the Bible, therefore we're bound to wrestle with it and try and work through how it fits into our understanding of God and our understanding of the whole story of God's people. So just to try and get us into that aura, if you like, of challenge and difficulty, I want you to spend a few minutes now in your groups just taking a look at this one passage from the book of Judges, chapter 11, verses 29 to 40. Some of you may know the story already. It's the story of Jephthah's daughter. So if we just spend 5 minutes having a look at that story as an example of something that might be quite challenging. And for example, have you heard a sermon preached on Jephthah's daughter recently? So just take a few minutes to explore that passage together. Sometimes, particularly in feminist discourse, the story of Jephthah's daughter is called a text of terror. And there are quite a few of those in the Old Testament, which is quite a challenge actually. So how do we, for example, share our faith? How do we make that story part of our faith? One of the words that emerged in our discussion here at Charlotte Brown House was the word context. It's really important to establish what the context is of the passage that we're reading. And that's absolutely true, because one of the first things that we'll do when we read a passage like this is to try and make sense of it. That's a good example of just picking a passage out of its wider context and asking us to wrestle with it. In a sense, that's part of the challenge actually of the lectionary week by week, that it just plucks passages out of context and asks us to interact with them. So always remember that context is important. When we get to the very last session of this block 1, we're going to be delving into the field of what is known as a scholarly term of hermeneutics, which means basically how we read and interpret the Bible. So we'll do a little bit more of that when we get to the end of block 1. But for now, whenever you're reading or listening to a text or a passage in church, for example, try and think about its overall structure, and try and be aware of yourself when you're actually interpreting what you're hearing. It's really hard not to interpret a text when you're listening to it straight away. And I've got this acronym here which I find quite helpful generally in life, but it's called THINK. Is what you're interpreting, or the way you're using a text, is it true? Of course, we can have a lot of philosophical discussion about what truth is, but is it true? Is it helpful? Is it inspiring? Is it necessary? Is it kind? It's kind of a good acronym for conversation in life generally, actually. But I find it quite useful to sometimes pause with a passage from the Bible, particularly a challenging one, and try and work through those different parameters. So here's a quote from a book by someone called Bishop Helen-Ann. Not quite sure who she is, but she's written a book called Making Sense of the Bible, and this is what she says about her book. What this book does aim to do is to encourage the asking of questions, knowing that it is not possible to obtain all the answers, allowing for an encounter with God in the spaces in between. This is itself a path of exploration that is rooted in our own particularity as children of God, allowing our own weakness to be held by God's generous grace. It is an approach modelled by the wisdom tradition of the Old Testament, present in the New Testament, and which involves the continuing search for meaning in life. This search involves living and learning together despite our differences. As has so often been demonstrated, however, it is the negotiating of those differences that so often makes the Bible seem remote and flat, when what we have in the Bible is a vibrant and varied collection of books that leave plenty of room for disagreement and debate. To encounter the Bible is to stand on holy ground, and any debate about it has something to do with God, whether we acknowledge that or not. Might be worth looking at that book. I might try and check out a copy. In his book, How to Explain Your Faith, Bishop John Pritchard has a chapter entitled, which I think is really good actually, The Bible, Big, Black and Boring? Question mark. It's not a statement, it's a question mark. He begins that chapter with a number of challenging points. And he says this, as well as being boring, the Bible's irrelevant. What's the dubious history of a migrant race in the Middle East over 2,000 years ago got to do with us today? Also, how can you trust what it says? Where's the evidence? How can you believe in Adam and Eve, Noah's Ark, and the people who lived for 175 years? Also, it's very variable in quality. Some parts are exquisite, and some parts are terrifyingly awful. bit like that passage we've just looked at on Jephthah's daughter. And then, why are just these books in the Bible? Other books tell different stories, but they got sidelined. Sounds like some kind of power play. Well, points to ponder at this time, again from Bishop John Pritchard, is whatever else you say about it, the Bible has fed the world and changed it. The overarching story of God has made sense of the world for countless millions of people. Civilizations have taken their moral shape from its teaching. Biblical narrative has inspired some of the world's greatest art, literature, poetry and drama. For centuries, no one could be called educated unless they knew its rich text. In short, the Bible has permeated our culture and many others. Ours is the first generation to be estranged from this core script. And that last sentence in particular, ours is the first generation to become estranged from this core script. That sentence is quite important and also quite provocative, but it's important for us at this time, and it's a kind of underpinning question for the whole of the LiFT course, because it is true in our society that biblical literacy is not what it used to be. It's not what it used to be. Knowledge of the Bible and its contents and the stories are not high today in the same way that they were once. And so that means that there's a real need to communicate the message of the Bible, its story, creatively and clearly for a new generation. And I wonder, how might we do that today? And what signs of this capacity and ability to communicate the Bible and its stories creatively or afresh to a new generation today, what signs of that do you see? At the same time, you might want to also reflect and pause on the specific role of the Bible and its narrative in the history of this country, of these islands. For example, the first sermon preached on Christmas Day in 1814, and other stories of Tarori of Waharoa, for example, and the role of the text and the narrative in that great story of reconciliation that Tarori's story is all about. So there are some unique ways in which the Bible has impacted on the life of this nation, really importantly. But equally there's the challenge of people just not knowing what the Bible is, or just not knowing what it contains. The Bible as a whole is quite a complex document. That's an understatement. The word Bible actually comes from the Greek word biblia, which means books. And so the Bible is not one book, it's actually a library of books, of 66 books, written over a period of at least 1,000 years, it's quite a long time, by different authors, in different contexts and with different goals. The Bible contains lots of different types of literature: law, history, poetry, wise sayings, prophecy, gospel, which in and of itself was an entirely new form of writing, letters and apocalyptic literature. That's the kind of literature that we get in the book of Revelation, for example, right at the end of the Bible. So when we're dealing with the Bible, it's much more complex than first meets the eye. We have to bear in mind this great spread of history and of people and of contexts that have produced the Bible. That's part of the challenge. So take a few minutes now in your local groups to reflect on some of that, on the challenge of helping people to understand the Bible, the prejudice perhaps that people have against it because they make certain assumptions that it is big and it's boring and it has no relevancy whatsoever to how we live our lives today. And maybe you can share, if you're aware of some creative and positive ways in which the biblical stories have been shared with people you know. What are the challenges, the joys and the opportunities in that? So have a go at discussing that, and I'll see you shortly. All right, so the Old Testament makes up about 3/4 of the Bible, so that's a good portion of the whole Bible. If you made a list of the Bible's 10 longest books, 9 of these come from the Old Testament. The Book of Psalms is the longest, with over, and trust me, I have not actually counted this, I have it on good authority, that there are over 43,700 words in the Psalms. And the only New Testament book in this list is Luke. And actually that's the 10th longest book in the Bible, coming in at about 25,900 words. So in spite of the fact that the writers of the New Testament saw the Old Testament as very important, you need to remember that in Jesus' context, the Old Testament, our Old Testament, was in fact, to all intents and purposes, the Bible for Jesus and for Jews in his context. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew with a bit of Aramaic. Now and then is a bit of a portion of the book of Daniel that lapses into Aramaic. It can appear a baffling assortment of material to the modern Christian, and therefore also to people who you might be trying to share the faith with. Part of the difficulty, I think, arises because the various parts of the Old Testament were written during a period of many hundreds of years, in many different styles, with a variety of purposes, something that we've already touched on. And we're not helped particularly either by the order of the various books in the Old Testament. They don't come necessarily in the order in which they were written, nor are they always in the chronological order of the events to which they refer. And they are not in the same order as in the Hebrew Bible either, because of changes made when a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible was made in the last centuries before the birth of Jesus. So there's actually quite a lot of complex stuff going on when we open an Old Testament, let alone when we start to try and read it and make sense of its narrative. So here's a point to ponder. Perhaps the best short description of the Old Testament is that it tells the story of how the Hebrew people's faith grew and developed. But Christians have always seen the Old Testament as more than just historical background, and that's a really important point. Hebrew writings have become part of Christian scripture because the first followers of Jesus believed that the Old Testament expresses the mind of God for communities and nations. Therefore, the Old Testament is for everyone. That's a really important part of our story as Christians, trying to make sense of it all, that the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, forms part of our faith journey, and we acknowledge that it informed the very origins of our faith journey. So we have to take it seriously. We cannot ignore it. Remember my point about the Old Testament being a library, being more than just one book. The books, broadly speaking, are arranged in the Old Testament by type, and also the Old Testament has the same pattern as the New Testament. So the books of narrative, of story, more or less come first, followed by writings which act to some extent as commentary on the narrative. So this little table that you've got on the top of page 41, you can see that the narrative books are divided into two sections. The Torah, or the law, which recounts the formative events for the people of Israel, so that's the books of Genesis through to Deuteronomy, and then books that might be described in a narrative form as the history of Israel, and that recounts events in the nation of Israel from the conquest of Canaan to the return from exile, and that's the books from Joshua through to Esther. So certainly in the Hebrew canon, in the Old Testament canon, those first 5 books are really important, and they are called the Torah, or the law. They are very important. Likewise, in the second part of that table, that is the writings, Again, we have two sections here to emphasise the distinction in the Hebrew canon between the prophetic books and more general writings. So you have wisdom literature, which is a mixture of poetic and proverbial material. That's from the book of Job through to the Song of Songs. And then the writings of the prophets. And this is the message and sometimes some information about the lives of the prophets living after the kingdom of Israel was divided into two. So that's everything from Isaiah through to Malachi. So that's a really simplistic way of looking at the overall structure of the Old Testament, but it might help you get a sense of what the material is and why it's arranged in such a way. If you look at the contents page of your Bible of the Old Testament, that will help you plot yourself through this table. So if you open your Old Testament and look at the contents page, then you begin to get a sense of, oh yes, that's Torah, that's narrative, there's the prophets, there's the wisdom literature, so things like Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. And then you get a sense of how it all is patched together. So the important thing to remember is that it's not a case of, it begins in Genesis and ends where it ends. There's a theme and a structure to how it's put together. And a lot of that has to do with simply grouping together blocks of material that seem quite the same. So think of it as going into your supermarket, heading down the cereal aisle, and you kind of get a sense of why the cereals are organised in the way they do. That's a bit of an interesting analogy, I know, but next time you visit the supermarket, it's all arranged for a reason. So that might help you understand a little bit of why the Old Testament's kind of structured in the way it is. You may find other analogies that are more helpful than that. Another way in which it can be helpful to think about the overall structure of the Old Testament is this summary here, that the Old Testament tells stories, it issues instructions, and it also gives lots of space to really important themes such as the family, honesty and fair dealing in business, experiencing depression, showing justice to the poor and the oppressed, being a good friend, and facing anger or failure. So there are different ways actually of opening the Old Testament to yourself and therefore to other people, because if you find yourself in a pastoral situation where somebody's wanting to express a real sense of frustration and anger, you just say, well, go to Job, delve into the book of Job, because if ever there was a book that deals so profoundly with the question of human suffering, it's right there in that book. And for my understanding of it, that's what makes the Bible really exciting and really potentially relevant to us today, because this is a work of great literature that can speak very profoundly into the human condition, and it's right there in the Bible. So I want you to spend a few minutes now in your local groups just sharing some thoughts on the Old Testament. And how often do you hear a sermon preached on the Old Testament on a Sunday? I know for my part, as somebody who preaches quite regularly, I tend always to go to the Gospel and preach on that. And this is making me think, well, maybe there are times when I should actually give the Old Testament a go. But how often do you hear a sermon preached on the Old Testament? And do you actually have a favourite story or a passage from the Old Testament? Okay, so focus your conversation around those 2 points, and I'll be back with you in a moment. So the first 5 books of the Bible, as I've mentioned earlier, are known as the Torah. And of course, they begin with these really well-known words. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So you sort of begin at the beginning. And it's quite useful to bear in mind that all stories actually have a beginning. They tend to have some kind of plot. And this is an ancient pattern that we can see throughout the Bible as a whole. The story of Jesus, for example, has a beginning, and there is a plot that follows through. There's a narrative shape to how it unfolds. The first 11 chapters of Genesis contain quite widely known stories, but often their picture of God seems quite strange and challenging. So stories such as Adam and Eve, as Cain and Abel, Methuselah, who made it to the grand old age of 969. Wow, I bet he had a great pension. Noah and the flood, that's another well-known one, and the Tower of Babel. When we get to Genesis 12, we begin to hit some really important parts of the unfolding narrative of the Old Testament, and that is the story of the call of Abraham. And Abraham is the first person for whom we have quite a detailed life story in the Bible. The story is set in about the year 2000 BC, and actually the rest of Genesis follows through Abraham's story. Now, we won't spend time on this right now. We have actually looked at the story of Abraham a couple of weeks ago, but if you get a chance during the week, try and do this exercise that's contained in the box on page 42, because it raises some really important and interesting questions about what this tells us about God and who we think God is through this story. After Abraham, then we get Jacob, and Jacob's alternative name was Israel, which is why his descendants are known as Israelites, meaning triumphant with God. Then we get Joseph. We were talking about Joseph in our group just a few moments ago, who's sold into slavery by his brothers but becomes a really important figure in Egypt. Change in leadership results in Jacob's family becoming slaves. By this time we're into the book of Exodus, and then we get the first appearance of another important figure, Moses. In Exodus 7 to 10, God brings 10 plagues on Egypt, which eventually causes Pharaoh to relent and let the Israelites go free under Moses' leadership. Moses then receives the famous 10 Commandments, and the law of Moses becomes a vital part of Israelite identity, and through that an important part of our identity too, though note the different ways in which the law, particularly the law of Moses, gets debated furiously by the time we get to Jesus. After the law books, that's the first 5 books, we get Joshua and Judges. Joshua took over from Moses after Moses had led the Israelites into Canaan. And of course, the slight awkward issue was that Canaan was already occupied by other people. Therefore, not surprisingly, what we get is quite a lot of warfare. And this whole period of warfare is described in the books of Joshua and Judges, with Judges containing the stories of 12 people who were leaders during this time and, surprise, surprise, known as judges, of whom Gideon, Samson and Deborah, interesting we have a female judge, are perhaps most notable. And then after the judges, the leadership model then gives way to the first of Israel's kings, and that's recounted to us in the first book of Samuel. The first king was Saul, and 1 Samuel tells us all about the story of Saul. After Saul dies, 2 Samuel picks up the story and tells us about David, and then Solomon. And after Solomon, his son Rehoboam took the throne. But, surprise, surprise, we get a bit more unrest and civil war. And then there's a fairly steady path towards Israel being conquered by Assyria and Babylon, which led to slavery and exile. Then we begin to get some of the prophets who are speaking into this situation and experience. So the book of Ezekiel, for example, is one of the prophets living in exile in Babylon who brought a message of hope that God would bring Israel home, which indeed did happen about 70 years after the exile began. And one of the first tasks that needed attending to when that happened was the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem, which is what we read about in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay, so that's a potted whiz through that part of the Old Testament. It's amazing what you can do in a paragraph, isn't it? Just when you think the Old Testament is this huge document, actually you can pretty much summarise it quite handily. That might be a useful reading guide to you as you go through it. The Old Testament contains a lot of poetry and songs, many of which, interestingly, remain used to this day, or at least you can often see how even contemporary songs reflect similar themes: celebration, mourning, and telling stories. Examples include the songs of Moses and Miriam, the song of Deborah and Barak, David's lament for Saul, and then, of course, the Psalms are a key element of the legacy of poetry. And the Psalms are fantastic because they reflect such a range of emotions: joy, thankfulness, faith in God, anger, despair, doubt and revenge. It's all in there in the book of Psalms. And we know that some of the Psalms were sung because they tell us this. For example, if you look at Psalm 150, you have this really colourful and resonant image of lots of sound being made to praise God. All sorts of things being used there. Also full of poetry is the Song of Songs, which is a love poem full of rich imagery. Trees clap their hands, hills sing for joy, God's enemies melt like wax. The sun is so eager to rise that it's like a bridegroom going to his wedding. And don't forget the memorable, the teeth of the beloved are like a flock of sheep. Handy in your rural contexts. And God rides on the clouds. And God's law is sweeter than honey dripping from the comb. Job, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes represent part of the wisdom tradition. And Job in particular is a really powerful book, which I've mentioned already, asking some really profound questions. Where is God when innocent people are suffering? And I think it's important to say that the Bible does not hold back from asking tough questions. And it's important for us, therefore, to continue this today. The Bible doesn't necessarily contain all the answers, but it does contain a lot of tough questions for us to reflect on together. The final section of the Old Testament contains the books of the prophets, and the prophets represent a different kind of leadership who appear alongside other leaders in the Old Testament narrative. There are stories about two main prophets during the early time of the kings. Look at Elijah and Elisha. And later prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah have their own books in the Old Testament. Now, Simon Jenkins, in his really useful book called The Bible from Scratch, provides a helpful summary of some of the key points about the prophets. Firstly, they spoke to their own generation. Secondly, they took the people back to Moses. Thirdly, they transformed the faith of ancient Israel. And finally, they looked ahead to the future. So those are really helpful tools, if you like, to put alongside a prophetic book. If you choose to spend some time, maybe you will, in the coming weeks. When you're reading a book of the prophets, just ask yourself those 4 points. How is this prophet speaking to its own generation? In what way are they taking people back to some of the origins, back to Moses? How is this prophet transforming the faith? And how are they also looking ahead to the future? And it actually raises some important questions about the role of prophets today. Although our canon is fixed and we don't put in more prophetic books to the Bible, there are people that you could describe as being prophetic in our own generation. So it's quite useful to think of them alongside some of the great biblical prophets that we read. Interestingly, the prophet Joel almost leans forward into the New Testament when he says, and this is quite relevant for this Sunday, which is the feast day of Pentecost, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your old men will dream dreams. Your young men will see visions. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my spirit in those days. That's a prophet that's kind of leaning into the world of the New Testament. And you may hear that read this Sunday on the feast day of Pentecost. So there's an awful lot to think about there and process, but the Bible is full of complex things to think about and process. Okay? And if you take anything away from this evening, it's that there are some pretty big themes in the Old Testament. There are some pretty big questions about God that are asked, and therefore about ourselves and our faith. Some answers, but by no means all of them. So it's kind of up to us as well to help make sense of what the complexity of the Old Testament is saying for our generation. That's a big challenge, but it's also a tremendous opportunity, and that's quite exciting as well. Now, a question that you might be left with when you have finished your complete read of the Old Testament is, well, what about the women? Okay, just think we need to name that. We've covered a few this evening, admittedly, but there is a question that is asked about the role of women in the Old Testament. There seems sometimes to be a distinct lack of key women, perhaps with the exception of Deborah the judge, who's a good figure. And we might also observe the way in which women are portrayed sometimes in the Old Testament is quite negative. And you can find lots of examples of that, alongside, of course, some examples of some not so well-behaved gentlemen. So we could do a whole course on the role of women in the Old Testament and the interpretation of stories about women, but just hold that point to ponder in mind when you're listening to an Old Testament passage. Okay, so where are the women? How balanced is this? And one way I find quite helpful to forge a path through it is to think about the whole of wisdom literature, because wisdom actually is a feminine word and a feminine image in the Old Testament. It's a feminine noun. Same goes with the Greek word for wisdom, Sophia. That is a feminine image. So arguably the whole wisdom tradition, which is really important, particularly in books like the Gospel of John, is actually a very feminine image. So maybe we need to recover that a little bit and celebrate that. So that's just a point to ponder during the week. Another couple of important things that you might want to think about, which are quite helpful and positive about the Old Testament, is this, that in the Old Testament God uses common people. There are all sorts of what you might describe as ordinary people that are used to dramatic effect. Joseph is a slave, saves his family. Moses is a shepherd, and he had committed a murder. He leads Israel into the promised land. Gideon's a farmer, and he delivers Israel from Midian. Hannah's a housewife, and she becomes the mother of Samuel, who's quite an important character. David is a shepherd, he becomes a king, and Esther is an orphan, and she manages to save her people from massacre. So a really important thing in the Old Testament is the way in which ordinary people are used to dramatic effect for the purposes of God's transformation of history. Secondly, as well as people, there are some pretty ordinary and common objects that are used to dramatic effect. Shepherd's staff used by Moses to work miracles. A ram's horn used by Joshua to flatten the walls of Jericho. That's quite dramatic. A fleece used by Gideon to confirm what God wanted Gideon to do. Oil used by Elisha to show God's power to provide. A river also used by Elisha to heal a man of leprosy. And pottery, that wonderful image in the book of Jeremiah as an object lesson about God, the Creator. So, lots of ordinary people, lots of ordinary objects used to great effect. Let's just spend a last few minutes together before we come back for a final few thoughts. Just reflecting on all of that material, there's quite a lot there, so you might just want to pick out one thing that has struck you as interesting. And I'll be with you in a few minutes. I hope that's it's been quite a full evening for us, trying to navigate the entire Old Testament. So if you're feeling a bit washed out, that's completely understandable and normal. We've done good to get through the Old Testament in one evening and solved all its questions and challenges, she said confidently. Next week we're going to begin our journey through the New Testament, and we're going to focus on the Gospels, mostly on the Gospels, and briefly on the book of Acts. So if you get a chance just to familiarise yourself again with the Gospels and with Acts, and if you get an opportunity to read Mark's Gospel, that is the shortest Gospel, that will be a really good thing if you have an opportunity to have a look at Mark's Gospel for next week. There's a section in John Pritchard's book Living Faithfully on building community, understanding that the New Testament is very much about building a new community of God's people. And finally, a short meditation from Stephen Cherry for you to ponder as you journal this week. Thanks for being with us again this evening, everybody. Hope you've had some good and challenging discussions. I'm going to bid farewell now to first of all to Dinsdale. Farewell, Dinsdale. Going to bid farewell to Tokoroa. Bye, Tokoroa. Waihi. See you next week, Waihi. Ka kite anō to Harborough, to Vincent and Kathleen. Great to see you both. New Plymouth. Farewell, New Plymouth. See you next week. Morrinsville. Where are you? See you next week, Morrinsville. Oh, yeah, great. Can see a few hands waving there. See you next week. And Taumaranui. See you next week. Taumaranui. Fantastic. And I'm going to say goodbye as well to all of those of you who are joining us offline during the week. Hope you have great sessions and see you next time. And finally, it's a goodbye from us here in Charlotte Brown House. Have a great week, everybody, and we'll see you next Tuesday. God bless.